Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. The New Mexico legislature provided nearly $500 million in additional K-12 education funding in 2019. The funds came after a ruling that the state was not providing an adequate education to at-risk students, and the plaintiffs in the case say that still is not happening. Before we begin, some background from the nonprofit New Mexico Kids Can. What does at-risk mean? To determine who is an at-risk student, New Mexico uses 3 criteria: income, English proficiency, and mobility. The state then awards funding to school districts based on how many at-risk students they serve. This means students from low socioeconomic areas, English learners, and students who move often are provided additional funding through a formula. To talk about that additional funding and much more, my guest today is the lead counsel in the education lawsuit, Gail Evans, at the New Mexico Center for Law and Poverty. Gail, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here today. You know, I want to start with that definition that I mentioned that the state uses for a funding formula. I think it's a good place to start. A lot of people watching this show may have heard parts of the formula, but not all of it. And a lot of people don't realize that while that is the funding formula, the education lawsuit goes beyond those 3 measures of English proficiency, mobility, whether they move a lot, students, and low socioeconomic status. Goes beyond that. If you can talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on whether the state funding formula is inadequate.
Sure. So the lawsuit focuses on 4 groups of students. Students who are English language learners, students with disabilities, Native American students, and students from low-income families. And those 4 groups of students make up about 80% or more of our student population in New Mexico. And we focused on those 4 groups of students because those students are the students who have had what we call an education gap in our state. They're graduating at lower rates than other students. They have lower reading and math proficiency scores than other students. They need more college remediation than other students. So these are the students in our state that have been underserved by our public school system. The schools in our state are funded through a mechanism that we call the funding formula. It's in state law. And one line in that funding formula is called the at-risk index. And there, additional money is directed towards districts when they have students that count as either low-income English language learner or mobile students, as you mentioned at the beginning. Now that line in the funding formula has in the past only controlled 3% of our entire public school budget. So
wow.
It has been relatively insignificant. Over the years, it has slowly crept up, and last year, it is true, the legislature doubled the amount of money that flowed through that one line of the funding formula. And so now that line of the funding formula is about, I would say, 15%. We're getting 15% more funding, I should say, for students who fall as being called at risk through that line of the funding formula than other students.
So to put that into perspective then, what you're saying is for a district that has, and we know there are many districts in New Mexico like this, low socioeconomic student body, almost all of the students, if not all, are low socioeconomic status. Many of them also may be learning English as a second language. They still would only get up to 15% more funding for that?
Per student.
Per student?
Per student
okay.
For that. So what the court found is that it would be reasonable, it would be a good idea to direct 25 to 50% more funding towards students who are classified as at risk. And so we have been slowly ratcheting that up, but our proposal last year was to increase the pot of money in that at-risk index so that it would actually provide 25% more funding for children who are counted as at risk under that part of the formula. And the legislature did not choose to do that.
Okay.
There are other places in the funding formula where students who are considered at risk also get other services and programs, and I'd like to talk more about that if there's an opportunity.
We will. As you mentioned, in the 2019 legislative session, additional money was provided. For 2020, we'll have to see what happens. I mentioned at the beginning of the program a nonprofit called New Mexico Kids Can, which has a website with lots of different information about this issue. One of the things they say that they're working toward for 2020, and this is what they call, quote, targeted differentiated support to all schools. I take that to mean that when schools have a particular need, it's addressed with a different funding level to meet the need. So you hinted at that a bit there in your answer about the increase in funding right now of 15% per student. But of course, different schools might have a different challenge, if you will. Is this a good approach?
I want to back up for a minute.
Yeah.
I want to explain that during the last legislative session, what happened, and you mentioned at the beginning that the state appropriated almost $500,000 more dollars. What happened with that money, and it actually wasn't $500,000, it was the money that actually ended up being spent was under $400,000. And that money was spent almost entirely on mandated salary increases for teachers. So even the money that flows through the at-risk index, this is all part of what's called operational funding for the schools.
And I was going to get just a moment, so hopefully I didn't misspeak, but in the intro I said $500 million. So
yes.
Over almost 500 million. So
yes.
But I realized that some of that, a good portion of that money went towards salaries. So
right,
as
and
I
so
understand
I
it,
should say $400 million.
There was, as I understand it, there was only about 100 million that was of the almost 500 million that went for at-risk students.
Right, that was additional money for it's flowing through what's called the at-risk index. It all goes to the operational funding of the school, and the districts were mandated by state law to give salary increases. And so once the salary increases were provided to their personnel, there wasn't money left to spend on programs and services for at-risk students. And this was an issue that we put the legislature on notice of before those laws were passed. We had determined with districts that there wouldn't be enough money after they did the salary increases to provide additional programs and services, and the legislature still chose to take this route. We're very pleased that teachers got raises. That is certainly a part of what's necessary to address the systemic problems in our school system, but that's only part of it.
Right.
And so the legislature didn't do other things that are also necessary, and the raises that the legislature funded weren't enough.
Yeah.
And there was no reason to wait. Why are we waiting to make our teachers' salaries competitive with other states when we have this massive recruitment and retention problem in our state? We could start nipping that in the bud right now if we just right away made our salaries competitive with other states.
Yeah, and just to give people some background on that, they raised the minimum starting salary for teachers from $36,000 to $41,000 a year. But as you know, just down the road in the El Paso Independent School District, new teachers are making about $50,000 a year. So we're talking still, even with the increase, we're talking about a deficit of about 20%. So probably isn't a surprise to people that we still are hearing about a teacher shortage, that there are a lot of substitutes that are teaching. I'll tell you one thing that did surprise me, though. It wouldn't surprise you as attorney on this case, but I think it's important to mention during this show. What this means in some cases is you may even have folks who are still going to school to become an educator. They're in their first teaching job ever, and they're being put in a special education class to teach special education students, something that one would think would require some specialized training and experience before you're put into that position.
Right, and this was part of the evidence that the court heard, these exact sorts of problems. And one of the proposals that we have to remedy that is to create incentives for young people in our state to want to become special ed teachers, bilingual teachers, is certified to teach English as a second language. I mean, we're looking for ways to build the capacity of our state to educate our students. And this really is a long-term, statewide effort that needs to be made. This case and the solution to our constitutional crisis in our education system, it doesn't lie in just providing more funding to the schools. It lies in a statewide cooperative effort with some strong leadership directing how we're going to build the capacity. We need infrastructure, we need Wi-Fi, we need teachers, we need social workers, we need people trained to work with our culturally and linguistically rich population. This is what it's going to take, and this is not what we've seen from the state in response to this ruling.
Okay. Let's go over some of the things that are in your motion that you say that the state is not doing well enough yet. One is just basic instructional materials and technology for classrooms. Give us a sense of that.
So again, this was something that really struck the judge in this case, was that we are really talking about some basic things. We're not talking about luxuries. And we have good laws on the books that talk about students having the right to textbooks. And sure, as things change, maybe those rights, we don't all need a written, a book, a hard copy of a book. Maybe there's stuff that we can pull down off the internet. We also have laws on the books that guarantee our students the right to a culturally and linguistically relevant textbook. And these materials need to be tailored to our students. None of this exists in our state. And so how do we get those culturally and linguistically relevant instructional materials, and how do we have the technology available so that all students, even students in rural parts of our state, have access to Wi-Fi? This is, again, it takes resources, it takes developing professional capacity in our state. There's a lot of work that's gone into exactly how we could build that out. There's been a lot of support from Native American tribes across the state, from culturally diverse populations across the state about how to do this, and we're hoping that the state will agree and will want to work with us to make this possible.
Okay, so in addition to just basic instructional materials and technology, you've mentioned there's also a need for materials that meet the cultural and linguistic needs of students. Another issue, pre-K, summer school, after school programs, reading specialists, and also smaller class sizes to children who need them. So these are also things that, as I understand, are research-based to help with students who may be behind.
Right, and again, the judge heard extensive evidence about how all of the things that you just mentioned have a significant impact on the opportunity for our students to be college and career ready. And basically how students from lower income backgrounds often come to school more than a year behind academically than their non-low income peers. And how with pre-K, that opportunity gap can be closed. And how if students have access to summer school, then over the summer, they're not sort of falling behind academically than their non-low income peers. How students, if they have these extended learning opportunities, it has a big impact on their ability to achieve and succeed in school. We provide all of these programs to some of our students, and this was really central to our case. Central to our case is that we know what works, that our state actually has a lot of expertise. We've done a lot of research. People at the legislature are very proud to announce that students who participate in both pre-K and in an extended learning program called K5+, that the reading achievement gap will close if students have the opportunity for both of those things. Well, if we know that, why aren't we making those programs available to all students who need them?
Yeah, and to give folks an idea of the specific programs we're talking about, social services, counseling, healthcare, and literacy specialists available, again, to all students who need them. This is mentioned specifically in your motion. We already talked about investing in educators. Another one, though, that might, I bet a lot of people watching didn't think of. I was actually not thinking of this when I was looking at this in your motion. Adequately increasing transportation budgets as well, because how do students get to after school programs and get home? What about summer programs? This is important too, right?
Right, so we're talking about the basics, right? Like it's not worth having the program if the child can't get there and can't get home. And a lot of parents, they won't have their students participate in those programs because they don't have the means to get them home if they didn't come on the bus home.
Yeah.
So there's a real shortage there. There's a big agreement that there's been a lack of funding there, and we need to see more resources put into our transportation.
Some of the people who are watching this program may remember seeing a story in the Albuquerque Journal about the fact that there is actually a questionnaire that is given to districts to ask them, how are you addressing at-risk needs? And I took a look at this on the answers to this questionnaire on the New Mexico Kids Can website. and was surprised to see exactly what the article said in the Albuquerque Journal, that some districts left this answer blank, some had a sentence or two, and many, even if they were long answers, they were very general. They didn't give any specifics about exactly what was being done to help at-risk students. I have a graphic actually here for the answer for Las Cruces Public Schools because I think it's instructive. They were one of the few districts that did have some specific information, and I want to ask you about some of the things they're doing. One is that they hired, according to this questionnaire, 6 truancy coaches who are going to work with students who are habitually truant and work directly with their families to ensure that they attend school on a regular basis. Give us a sense of the importance of this.
So this is a critical piece, and it's a piece that a lot of districts talk about, that they don't have the resources to hire the truancy coaches that they need. There used to be a specific line in the funding formula for schools for districts to have money for those truancy coaches. That line no longer exists. And so instead, districts are now supposed to use money that flows through that at-risk index for this purpose. But if there isn't enough money there, it can't be done. So, but yes, I think this is a great use of that funds for a district like Cruces that's found a way to make that work.
Yeah, no surprise here. I mean, I remember even when studying education, seeing data on this, that even students who may not come from a low socioeconomic background, no surprise, if they don't attend school regularly, they do poorly in school. So the notion of addressing attendance is pretty much common sense, but it's also research-based. We know from research that this is incredibly important. Another one is improving the services to English learner populations by expanding what the Las Cruces Public Schools calls its International Welcome Center into all 8 middle schools. They have hired, according to the questionnaire, 8 advisors to work directly with English language learners, immigrant and international student populations. Thoughts on this?
Yeah, I love this idea. Las Cruces told me they were doing this, and again, it's a great thing to be doing, and we applaud them for that.
And we've seen certainly with the news of families who have come from Central America seeking asylum, the importance of addressing the needs of those young people in class. One unforgettable interview for me shortly after I arrived here in Las Cruces was with a young man at New Mexico State University who has long since graduated, I'm happy to say, from NMSU, who came from El Salvador to Las Cruces and did not speak any English, became fully proficient in English at Las Cruces High School. So we know this when students have the education and the opportunity, it can work wonders.
And that was what the case is based on, and what the judge found is that every student can learn, that our students are just as capable as students anywhere in the country, and that there are certain programs and services that must be provided, and then so that they all have the opportunity to be college and career ready.
Yeah.
And it can be done.
Can be done. A final thing that relates to this that Las Cruces Public Schools on its questionnaire said that they were doing is they hired 5 translators and interpreters assisting schools in ensuring that communication is achieved with parents of the students who are at risk. I guess this is also, again, a very important aspect to this.
Yes, and having parental and community involvement in a child's education, and whether Las Cruces has enough resources to do enough of that, I think is still an outstanding question. I think that Las Cruces would agree that even with their increased funding and their ability to do some of these things, they don't have the resources they need to actually provide their diverse student population with everything that their students need to be college and career ready.
So this show is going to be airing prior to the 2020 legislative session, when these decisions will be made about whether or not to further increase funding. What happens next if the state legislature again does not fulfill the needs? What will happen?
So I think we have to remember that the additional money that the state put in last year did not even get our schools' budgets back to where they were in 2008. So even though we talk a lot about, oh, this $400 million, it did not get us back to 2008 levels when our schools were underfunded. So we are hopeful that the legislature is going to take bigger steps during the upcoming session. But like I said, this is not about just funding in a much bigger way the public schools. It's also about funding our institutes of higher ed to build the capacity to develop our teacher workforce. And it's about funding different centers of excellence to build the Native American educator capacity in our state so that we can be working with the tribes better and preserving native languages in our schools. All of these things are in law in our state already. They're just not happening.
Yeah.
And
so a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work to be done, and we're hopeful with the motion that we filed that the state will actually pound out and develop the kind of planning and funding that it's going to take. And we would always love to sit down with the state and work with them to help develop that plan.
Okay. Gail Evans, she is lead counsel on the education lawsuit. You hear it referred to by the plaintiff's name, Yazzie and Martinez. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.